The Beach Boys are an American rock band that formed in Hawthorne, California, in 1961. The group's original lineup consisted of brothers Brian, Dennis, and Carl Wilson, their cousin Mike Love, and friend Al Jardine. Distinguished by their vocal harmonies, adolescent-oriented themes, and musical ingenuity, they are one of the most influential acts of the rock era. They drew on the music of older pop vocal groups, 1950s rock and roll, and black R&B to create their unique sound, and under Brian's direction, often incorporated classical or jazz elements and unconventional recording techniques in innovative ways. One of the first self-contained rock groups, the Beach Boys began as a garage band, managed by the Wilsons' father Murry, and with Brian as composer, arranger, producer, and de facto leader. In 1963, they had their first national hit with Surfin USA, beginning a string of top 10 singles that reflected a Southern California youth culture of surfing, cars, and romance, dubbed the California Sound. They were one of the few American rock bands to sustain their commercial standing during the British invasion. Starting with 1965's The Beach Boys Today, they abandoned beachgoing themes for more personal lyrics and ambitious orchestrations. In 1966, the Pet Sounds album and Good Vibrations single raised the group's prestige as rock innovators. After scrapping the Smile album in 1967, Brian gradually ceded control of the group to his bandmates. In the late 1960s, the group's commercial momentum faltered in the U.S., and despite efforts to maintain an experimental sound, they were widely dismissed by the early rock music press. Carl took over as the band's musical leader. Records from this period later enjoyed a cult following among fans. In the mid-1970s, as their concerts drew larger audiences, the band transitioned into an oldies act. Dennis drowned in 1983 and Brian soon became estranged from the group. Following Carl's death from lung cancer in 1998, the band granted Love legal rights to tour under the group's name. In the early 2010s, the original members briefly reunited for the band's 50th anniversary. As of 2021, Wilson and Jardine do not perform with Love's edition of the Beach Boys, but remain official members of the band. The Beach Boys are one of the most critically acclaimed and commercially successful bands of all time, selling over 100 million records worldwide. They helped legitimize popular music as a recognized art form and influence the development of music genres and movements such as psychedelia, power pop, progressive rock, punk, alternative, and lo-fi. Between the 1960s and 2010s, the group had 36 songs reach the U.S. Top 40, with 4 topping the Billboard Hot 100. In 2004, they were ranked number 12 on Rolling Stone's list of the greatest artists of all time. The founding members were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988. History 1958–1961. Formation at the time of his 16th birthday on June 20, 1958. Brian Wilson shared a bedroom with his brothers, Dennis and Carl, aged 13 and 11, respectively, in their family home in Hawthorne. He had watched his father Murry Wilson play piano, and had listened intently to the harmonies of vocal groups such as the Four Freshmen. After dissecting songs such as Ivory Tower and Good News, Brian would teach family members how to sing the background harmonies. For his birthday that year, Brian received a reel-to-reel tape recorder. He learned how to overdub, using his vocals and those of Carl and their mother. Brian played piano with Carl and David Marks, an 11-year-old longtime neighbor, playing guitars they had each received as Christmas presents. Soon Brian and Carl were avidly listening to Johnny Otis' KFOX radio show. Inspired by the simple structure and vocals of the rhythm and blues songs he heard, Brian changed his piano playing style and started writing songs. Family gatherings brought the Wilsons in contact with cousin Mike Love. Brian taught Love's sister Maureen and a friend harmonies. Later, Brian, Love and 2 friends performed at Hawthorne High School. Brian also knew Al Jardine, a high school classmate. Brian suggested to Jardine that they team up with his cousin and brother Carl. Love gave the fledgling band its name, the Pendletones, a pun on Pendleton, a style of woolen shirt popular at the time. Dennis was the only avid surfer in the group, and he suggested that the group write songs that celebrated the sport and the lifestyle that it had inspired in Southern California. Brian finished the song, titled Surfin', and with Mike Love, wrote, Surfin' Safari. Murry recalled, they had written a song called, Surfin', which I never did like and still don't like, it was so rude and crude. Murry Wilson, who was a sometime songwriter, arranged for the Pendletones to meet his publisher Hite Morgan. He said, "Finally, agreed to hear it, and Mrs. Morgan said, 'Drop everything, we're going to record your song. I think it's good. And she's the one responsible.'" On September 15, 1961, the band recorded a demo of "Surfin" with the Morgans. A more professional recording was made on October 3, at World Pacific Studio in Hollywood. David Marks was not present at the session as he was in school that day. Murry brought the demos to Herb Newman, owner of Cadets Records and Era Records, and he signed the group on December 8. When the single was released a few weeks later, the band found that they had been renamed The Beach Boys. Cadets wanted to name the group the Surfers until Russ Regan, a young promoter with Era Records, noted that there already existed a group by that name. He suggested calling them the Beach Boys. Surfin' was a regional success for the West Coast, and reached number 75 on the national Billboard Hot 100 chart. It was so successful that the number of unpaid orders for the single bankrupted Cadets. 1962–1967. Peak years: Surfin Safari, Surfin USA, Surfer Girl, and Little Deuce Coupe. By this time the de facto manager of the Beach Boys, Murry landed the group's first paying gig on New Year's Eve, 1961. At the Ritchie Valens Memorial Dance in Long Beach. In their earliest public appearances, the band wore heavy wool jacket-like shirts that local surfers favored before switching to their trademark striped shirts and white pants. In early 1962, Morgan requested that some of the members add vocals to a couple of instrumental tracks that he had recorded with other musicians. This led to the creation of the short-lived group Kenny and the Cadets, which Brian led under the pseudonym, Kenny. The other members were Carl, Jardine, and the Wilsons' mother Audrey. In February, Jardine left the Beach Boys to study dentistry and was replaced by David Marks. Murry remembered that after "Surfin'", the group had a difficult time being picked up by another label. They thought a one-shot record. After being turned down by Dot and Liberty, the Beach Boys signed a 7-year contract with Capitol Records. This was at the urging of Capitol executive and staff producer Nick Vennett, who signed the group, seeing them as the "teenage gold" he had been scouting for. On June 4, 1962, the Beach Boys debuted on Capitol with their second single, Surfin' Safari, backed with 409. The release prompted national coverage in the June 9 issue of Billboard, which praised Love's lead vocal and said the song had potential. Surfin' Safari rose to number 14 and found airplay in New York and Phoenix, a surprise for the label. The Beach Boys completed their first album, Surfin' Safari, with production credited to Nick Vennett. Carl later denied that Vennett had any significant role in the group's early music, saying that Vennett would be in the booth, and he would call the take number, and that was about it. "I wouldn't call him a musical heavy by any." Brian didn't want anything to do with Vennett. Surfin' Safari, released in October 1962, was different from other rock albums of the time in that it consisted almost entirely of original songs, primarily written by Brian with Mike Love and friend Gary Usher. Another unusual feature of the Beach Boys was that, although they were marketed as surf music, their repertoire bore little resemblance to the music of other surf bands, which was mainly instrumental and incorporated heavy use of spring reverb. For this reason, some of the Beach Boys' early local performances had young audience members throwing vegetables at the band, believing that the group were poseurs. In January 1963, the Beach Boys recorded their first top 10 single, Surfin USA, which began their long run of highly successful recording efforts. It was during the sessions for this single that Brian made the production decision from that point on to use double tracking on the group's vocals, resulting in a deeper and more resonant sound. The album of the same name followed in March and reached number 2 on the Billboard charts. Its success propelled the group into a nationwide spotlight, and was vital to launching surf music as a national craze, albeit the Beach Boys' vocal approach to the genre, not the original instrumental style pioneered by Dick Dale. Biographer Luis Sanchez highlights the "Surfin USA" single as a turning point for the band, create a direct passage to California life for a wide teenage audience. A distinct Southern California sensibility that exceeded its conception as such to advance right to the front of American consciousness. Throughout 1963, and for the next few years, Brian produced a variety of singles for outside artists. Among these were the Honeys, a surfer trio that comprised sisters Diane and Marilyn Rovell with cousin Ginger Blake. Brian was convinced that they could potentially be a successful female counterpart to the Beach Boys, and he produced a number of singles for them, although they could not replicate the Beach Boys' popularity. He also attended some of Phil Spector's sessions at Gold Star Studios. His creative and songwriting interests were revamped upon hearing the Ronettes' 1963 song, Be My Baby, which was produced by Spector. The first time he heard the song was while driving, and was so overwhelmed that he had to pull over to the side of the road and analyze the chorus. Later, he reflected, "I was unable to really think as a producer up until the time where I really got familiar with Phil Spector's work. That was when I started to design the experience to be a record rather than just a song." Surfer Girl marked the first time the group used outside musicians on a substantial portion of an LP. Many of them were the musicians Spector used for his wall of sound productions. To close 1963, the band released a standalone Christmas-themed single, Little Saint Nick, backed with an a cappella rendition of the scriptural song, The Lord's Prayer. The A-side peaked at number 3 on the U.S. Billboard Christmas chart. British Invasion, Shut Down, All Summer Long, and Christmas album The Surf Music Craze, along with the careers of nearly all surf acts, was slowly replaced by the British Invasion. Following a successful Australasian tour in January and February 1964, the Beach Boys returned home to face their new competition, the Beatles. Both groups shared the same record label in the U.S., and Capitol's support for the Beach Boys immediately began waning. This caused Murry to fight for the band at the label more than before, often visiting their offices without warning to twist executive arms. Carl said that Phil Spector was Brian's favorite kind of rock. He liked better than the early Beatles stuff. He loved the Beatles' later music when they evolved and started making intelligent, masterful music, but before that Phil was it. According to Mike Love, Carl followed the Beatles closer than anyone else in the band, while Brian was the most rattled by the Beatles and felt tremendous pressure to keep pace with them. For Brian, the Beatles ultimately eclipsed a lot we'd worked for. Eclipsed the whole music world. Brian wrote his last surf song in April 1964. That month, during recording of the single, I Get Around, Murry was relieved of his duties as manager. He remained in close contact with the group and attempted to continue advising on their career decisions. When I Get Around was released in May, it would climb to number 1 in the US and Canada, their first single to do so, proving that the Beach Boys could compete with contemporary British pop groups. In July, the album that the song appeared on, All Summer Long, reached number 4 in the US. All Summer Long introduced exotic textures to the Beach Boys' sound exemplified by the piccolos and xylophones of its title track. The album was a swan song to the surf and car music the Beach Boys built their commercial standing upon. Later albums took a different stylistic and lyrical path. Before this, a live album, Beach Boys Concert, was released in October to a 4-week chart stay at number 1, containing a setlist of previously recorded songs and covers that they had not yet recorded. In June 1964, Brian recorded the bulk of the Beach Boys' Christmas album with a 41-piece studio orchestra in collaboration with 4 freshman arranger Dick Reynolds. The album was a response to Phil Spector's A Christmas Gift for You. Released in December, the Beach Boys album was divided between 5 new, original Christmas-themed songs, and 7 reinterpretations of traditional Christmas songs. It would be regarded as one of the finest holiday albums of the rock era. One single from the album, The Man with All the Toys, was released, peaking at number 6 on the U.S. Billboard Christmas chart. On October 29, the Beach Boys performed for the TAMI Show, a concert film intended to bring together a wide range of musicians for a one-off performance. The result was released to movie theaters 1 month later. Today, Summer Days and Party. By the end of 1964, the stress of road travel, writing, and producing became too much for Brian. On December 23, while on a flight from Los Angeles to Houston, he suffered a panic attack. In January 1965, he announced his withdrawal from touring to concentrate entirely on songwriting and record production. For the rest of 1964 and into 1965, session musician Glenn Campbell served as Brian's temporary replacement in concert. Carl took over as the band's musical director on stage. Now a full-time studio artist, Brian wanted to move the Beach Boys beyond their surf aesthetic, believing that their image was antiquated and distracting the public from his talents as a producer and songwriter.
In the period following his resignation from touring, Brian put more distance between him and his bandmates, and began expanding his social circle to include a mix of worldly-minded friends, musicians, mystics and business advisors.
He also took an increasing interest in the developing Los Angeles hip scene and in recreational drugs. Musically, he said he began to take the things I learned from Phil Spector and use more instruments whenever I could. I doubled up on basses and tripled up on keyboards, which made everything sound bigger and deeper. Released in March 1965, The Beach Boys' Today marked the first time the group experimented with the album as art form. The tracks on Side 1 feature an uptempo sound that contrasts Side 2, which consists mostly of emotional ballads. Music writer Scott Schinder referenced its suite-like structure as an early example of the rock album format being used to make a cohesive artistic statement. Brian also established his new lyrical approach toward the autobiographical. Journalist Nick Kent wrote that the subjects of Brian's songs were suddenly no longer simple happy souls harmonizing their sun-kissed innocence and dying devotion to each other over a honey-coated backdrop of surf and sand. Instead, they'd become highly vulnerable, slightly neurotic and riddled with telling insecurities. In the book Yeah Yeah Yeah! The Story of Modern Pop, Bob Stanley remarked that, Brian was aiming for Johnny Mercer but coming up proto-indie. In 2012, the album was voted 271 on Rolling Stone magazine's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. In April 1965, Campbell's own career success pulled him from touring with the group. Columbia Records staff producer Bruce Johnston was asked to locate a replacement for Campbell. Having failed to find one, Johnston himself became a full-time member of the band on May 19, 1965, first replacing Brian on the road and later contributing in the studio, beginning with the June 4 vocal sessions for "California Girls", which first appeared in the band's next album Summer Days and eventually charted at number 3 in the US while the album went to number 2.
The album also included a reworked arrangement of "Help Me, Rhonda", which became the band's second #1 U.S. single in the spring of 1965. To appease Capitol's demands for a Beach Boys LP for the 1965 Christmas season, Brian conceived Beach Boys Party, a live-in-the-studio album consisting mostly of acoustic covers of 1950s rock and R&B songs, in addition to covers of 3 Beatles songs, Bob Dylan's "The Times They Are A-Chongin', and idiosyncratic re-recordings of the group's earlier songs. The album was an early precursor of the "unplugged" trend. It included a cover of the Regent song, Barbara Ann, which unexpectedly reached number 2 when released several weeks later. In November, the group released another top 20 single, The Little Girl I Once Knew. It was considered the band's most experimental statement thus far. The single continued Brian's ambitions for daring arrangements, featuring unexpected tempo changes and numerous false endings. It was the band's second single not to reach the US top 10 since their 1962 breakthrough, peaking at number 20. According to Luis Sanchez, in 1965, Bob Dylan was rewriting the rules for pop success with his music and image, and it was at this juncture that Wilson led the Beach Boys into a transitional phase in an effort to win the pop terrain that had been thrown up for grabs. Pet Sounds. Wilson collaborated with jingle writer Tony Asher for several of the songs on the album Pet Sounds, a refinement of the themes and ideas that were introduced in Today. In some ways, the music was a jarring departure from their earlier style. Jardine explained that, "It took us quite a while to adjust to because it wasn't music you could necessarily dance to, it was more like music you could make love to." In the Journal on the Art of Record Production, Marshall Heiser writes that Pet Sounds diverges from previous Beach Boys efforts in several ways. Its sound field has a greater sense of depth and warmth. The songs employ even more inventive use of harmony and chord voicings, the prominent use of percussion as a key feature, whilst the orchestrations, at times, echo the quirkiness of Exotica bandleader Les Baxter, or the cool of Burt Bacharach, more so than Spector's teen fanfares. For Pet Sounds, Brian desired to make a complete statement, similar to what he believed the Beatles had done with their newest album Rubber Soul, released in December 1965. Brian was immediately enamored with the album, given the impression that it had no filler tracks, a feature that was mostly unheard of at a time when 45 revolutions per minute singles were considered more noteworthy than full-length LPs. He later said, "It didn't make me want to copy them but to be as good as them. I didn't want to do the same kind of music, but on the same level." Thanks to mutual connections, Brian was introduced to the Beatles' former press officer Derek Taylor, who was subsequently employed as the Beach Boys' publicist. Responding to Brian's request to reinvent the band's image, Taylor devised a promotion campaign with the tagline, "Brian Wilson is a genius," a belief Taylor sincerely held. Taylor's prestige was crucial in offering a credible perspective to those on the outside, and his efforts are widely recognized as instrumental in the album's success in Britain. Released on May 16, 1966, Pet Sounds was widely influential and raised the band's prestige as an innovative rock group. Early reviews for the album in the U.S. ranged from negative to tentatively positive, and its sales numbered approximately 500,000 units, a drop-off from the run of albums that immediately preceded it.
It was assumed that Capitol considered Pet Sounds a risk, appealing more to an older demographic than the younger, female audience upon which the Beach Boys had built their commercial standing.
Within 2 months, the label capitulated by releasing the group's first greatest hits compilation, Best of the Beach Boys, which was quickly certified gold by the RIAA. By contrast, Pet Sounds met a highly favorable critical response in Britain, where it reached number 2 and remained among the top 10 positions for 6 months. Responding to the hype, Melody Maker ran a feature in which many pop musicians were asked whether they believed that the album was truly revolutionary and progressive, or as sickly as peanut butter. The author concluded that the record's impact on artists and the men behind the artists has been considerable. In its evaluation of Pet Sounds, the book 101 Albums That Changed Popular Music calls it one of the most innovative recordings in rock, and states that it elevated Brian Wilson from talented bandleader to studio genius. In 1995, a panel of numerous musicians, songwriters and producers assembled by Mojo voted Pet Sounds the greatest record ever made. Paul McCartney frequently spoke of his affinity with the album, citing "God Only Knows" as his favorite song of all time, and crediting it with furthering his interest in devising melodic bass lines. He said that Pet Sounds was the primary impetus for the Beatles' 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. According to author Karis Wynne-Jones, the interplay between the two groups during the Pet Sounds era remains one of the most noteworthy episodes in rock history. In 2003, when Rolling Stone magazine created its list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, the publication placed Pet Sounds second to honor its influence on the highest-ranked album, Sgt. Pepper, Good Vibrations, and Smile. Throughout the summer of 1966, Brian concentrated on finishing the group's next single, Good Vibrations. Instead of working on whole songs with clear large-scale syntactical structures, he limited himself to recording short interchangeable fragments. Through the method of Tate splicing, each fragment could then be assembled into a linear sequence, allowing any number of larger structures and divergent moods to be produced at a later time. Coming at a time when pop singles were usually recorded in under 2 hours, it was one of the most complex pop productions ever undertaken, with sessions for the song stretching over several months in 4 major Hollywood studios. It was also the most expensive single ever recorded to that point, with production costs estimated to be in the tens of thousands. In the midst of Good Vibrations sessions, Wilson invited session musician and songwriter Van Dyke Parks to collaborate as lyricist for the Beach Boys' next album project, soon titled Smile. Parks agreed. Wilson and Parks intended Smile to be a continuous suite of songs linked both thematically and musically, with the main songs linked together by small vocal pieces and instrumental segments that elaborated on the major songs' musical themes. It was explicitly American in style and subject, a conscious reaction to the overwhelming British dominance of popular music at the time. Some of the music incorporated chanting, cowboy songs, explorations in Indian and Hawaiian music, jazz, classical tone poems, cartoon sound effects, musique concrète, and yodeling. Saturday Evening Post writer Jules Siegel recalled that, on one October evening, Brian announced to his wife and friends that he was writing a teenage symphony to God. Recording for Smile lasted about a year, from mid-1966 to mid-1967, and followed the same modular production approach as Good Vibrations. Concurrently, Wilson planned many different multimedia side projects, such as a sound effects collage, a comedy album, and a health food album. Capitol did not support all these ideas, which led to the Beach Boys' desire to form their own label, Brother Records. According to biographer Stephen Gaines, Wilson employed his newfound best friend, David Anderley, as head of the label. Throughout 1966, EMI flooded the UK market with previously unreleased Beach Boys albums, including Beach Boys Party, The Beach Boys Today, and Summer Days, and Best of the Beach Boys was number 2 there for several weeks at the end of the year. Over the final quarter of 1966, the Beach Boys were the highest-selling album act in the UK, where for the first time in 3 years American artists broke the chart dominance of British acts. In 1971, Q magazine wrote that, from mid-1966 to late 1967, the Beach Boys were among the vanguard in practically every aspect of the counterculture. Released on October 10, 1966, Good Vibrations was the Beach Boys' third U.S. number 1 single, reaching the top of the Billboard Hot 100 in December, and became their first number 1 in Britain.
That month, the record was their first single certified gold by the RIAA. It came to be widely acclaimed as one of the greatest masterpieces of rock music. In December 1966, the Beach Boys were voted the top band in the world in the NME's annual Readers' Poll, ahead of the Beatles, the Walker Brothers, the Rolling Stones, and the Four Tops.
Throughout the first half of 1967, the album's release date was repeatedly postponed as Brian tinkered with the recordings, experimenting with different takes and mixes, unable or unwilling to supply a final version. Meanwhile, he suffered from delusions and paranoia, believing on one occasion that the would-be album track Fire caused a building to burn down. On January 3, 1967, Carl Wilson refused to be drafted for military service, leading to indictment and criminal prosecution, which he challenged as a conscientious objector. The FBI arrested him in April, and it took several years for courts to resolve the matter. After months of recording and media hype, Smile was shelved for personal, technical, and legal reasons. A February 1967 lawsuit seeking $255,000 was launched against Capitol Records over neglected royalty payments. Within the lawsuit was an attempt to terminate the band's contract with Capitol before its November 1969 expiry. Many of Wilson's associates, including Parks and Anderley, disassociated themselves from the group by April 1967. Brian later said, "Time can be spent in the studio to the point where you get so next to it, you don't know where you are with it, you decide to just chuck it for a while." In the decades following Smile's non-release, it became the subject of intense speculation and mystique and the most legendary unreleased album in pop music history. Many of the album's advocates believe that had it been released, it would have altered the group's direction and cemented them at the vanguard of rock innovators. In 2011, Uncut magazine staff voted Smile the greatest bootleg recording of all time. 1967 to 1969, faltered popularity and Brian's reduced involvement. Smiley Smile and Wild Honey. In May 1967, the Beach Boys attempted to tour Europe with 4 extra musicians brought from the U.S., but were stopped by the British Musicians Union. The tour went on without the extra support, and critics described their performances as amateurish and floundering. At the last minute, the Beach Boys declined to headline the Monterey Pop Festival, an event held in June. According to David Leaf, Monterey was a gathering place for the far-out sounds of the new rock. And it is thought that non-appearance was what really turned the underground tide against them. Fan magazine speculated that the group was on the verge of breaking up. Detractors called the band the Bleach Boys and the California Hypes as media focus shifted from Los Angeles to the happenings in San Francisco. Although Smile had been cancelled, the Beach Boys were still under pressure and a contractual obligation to record and present an album to Capitol. Carl remembered, "Brian just said, I can't do this. We're going to make a homespun version of Instead. We're just going to take it easy. I'll get in the pool and sing. Or let's go in the gym and do our parts." That was Smiley Smile. Sessions for the new album lasted from June to July 1967 at Brian's new makeshift home studio. Most of the album featured the Beach Boys playing their own instruments, rather than the session musicians employed in much of their previous work. It was the first album for which production was credited to the entire group instead of Brian alone. When asked if Brian was still the producer of Smiley Smile, Carl answered, "Most definitely." In July 1967, lead single, Heroes and Villains, was issued, arriving after months of public anticipation, and reached number 12 in U.S. It was met with general confusion and underwhelming reviews, and in the NME, Jimi Hendrix famously dismissed it as a psychedelic barbershop quartet. By then, the group's lawsuit with Capitol was resolved,
and it was agreed that Smile would not be the band's next album. In August, the group embarked on a 2-date tour of Hawaii.
Bruce Johnston, who was absent for most of the Smiley Smile recording, did not accompany the group, but Brian did.
The performances were filmed and recorded with the intention of releasing a live album, Laid in Hawaii, which was also left unfinished and unreleased. Smiley Smile was released on September 18, 1967, and peaked at number 41 in the U.S., making it their worst-selling album to that date. It began a string of underperforming Beach Boys albums that lasted until 1974. When released in the UK in November, it performed better, reaching number 9.
Critics and fans were generally underwhelmed by the album.
According to Scott Shinder, the album was released to general incomprehension. While Smile may have divided the Beach Boys fans had it been released, Smiley Smile merely baffled them. Over the years, the album gathered a reputation as one of the best, chill-out, albums to listen to during an LSD come-down. In 1974, NME voted it the 64th greatest album of all time. The Beach Boys immediately recorded a new album, Wild Honey, an excursion into soul music. Carl described it as music for Brian to cool out by. He was still very spaced. The album was a self-conscious attempt by the Beach Boys to regroup themselves as a rock band in opposition to their more orchestral affairs of the past. Its music differs in many ways from previous Beach Boys records. It contains very little group singing compared to previous albums, and mainly features Brian singing at his piano. Again, the Beach Boys recorded mostly at his home studio.
Love reflected that Wild Honey was completely out of the mainstream for what was going on at that time, which was all hard rock, psychedelic music.
It just didn't have anything to do with what was going on, and that was the idea. Wild Honey was released on December 18, 1967, in competition with the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour and the Rolling Stones' Their Satanic Majesty's Request. It had a lower chart placing than Smiley Smile and remained on the charts for only 15 weeks. As with Smiley Smile, contemporary critics viewed it as inconsequential, and it alienated fans whose expectations had been raised by Smile. That month, Mike Love told a British journalist, "Brian has been rethinking our recording program, and in any case we all have a much greater say nowadays in what we turn out in the studio." Wild Honey remained the last Beach Boys album to feature Brian as a primary composer until 1977. Over the coming months, its non-conforming approach was echoed in albums released by Bob Dylan, The Kinks, and The Byrds.
Friends, 2020, and Manson Affair. The Beach Boys were at their lowest popularity in the late 1960s, and their cultural standing was especially worsened by their public image, which remained incongruous with their peers' heavier music. At the end of 1967, Rolling Stone co-founder and editor Jan Wenner printed an influential article that denounced the Beach Boys as just one prominent example of a group that has gotten hung up on trying to catch the Beatles. "It's a pointless pursuit." The article had the effect of excluding the group among serious rock fans, and such controversy followed them into the next year. Capitol continued to bill them as America's top surfin' group, and expected Brian to write more beach-going songs for the yearly summer markets. From 1968 onward, his songwriting output declined substantially, but the public narrative of Brian as leader continued. The group also stopped wearing their longtime striped shirt stage uniforms in favor of matching white, polyester suits that resembled a Las Vegas show band's. After meeting Maharishi Mahesh Yogi at a UNICEF Variety Gala in Paris, Love and other high-profile celebrities such as the Beatles and Donovan traveled to Rishikesh, India, in February to March 1968. The following Beach Boys album, Friends, had songs influenced by the transcendental meditation the Maharishi taught. In support of Friends, Love arranged for the Beach Boys to tour with the Maharishi in the U.S. Starting on May 3, 1968, the tour lasted 5 shows and was cancelled when the Maharishi withdrew to fulfill film contracts. Because of disappointing audience numbers and the Maharishi's withdrawal, 24 tour dates were cancelled at a cost estimated at $250,000. Friends, released on June 24, peaked at number 126 in the U.S. In August, Capitol issued a collection of Beach Boys backing tracks, Stacko Tracks. It was the first Beach Boys LP that failed to chart in the US and UK. In June 1968, Dennis befriended Charles Manson, an aspiring singer-songwriter, and their relationship lasted for several months.
Dennis bought him time at Brian's home studio, where recording sessions were attempted while Brian stayed in his room. Dennis then proposed that Manson be signed to Brother Records. Brian reportedly disliked Manson, and a deal was never made. In July 1968, the group released a standalone single, "Do It Again," in the style of their earlier songs. Around this time, Brian admitted himself to a psychiatric hospital. His bandmates wrote and produced material in his absence. To complete their contract with Capitol, they produced one more album, 2020, released in January 1969. It consisted mostly of outtakes and leftovers from recent albums. Brian produced virtually none of the newer recordings. In 1976, Dennis called it, "the only letdown of the Beach Boys' career that embarrassed me through and through. We had to find things that Brian worked on and try and piece it together. That's when no involvement at all. The Beach Boys recorded one song by Manson without his involvement. Cease to Exist, rewritten as, Never Learn Not to Love, which was included on 2020. As his cult of followers took over Dennis's home, Dennis gradually distanced himself from Manson. According to Leaf, the entire Wilson family reportedly feared for their lives. In August, the Manson family committed the Tate La Bianca murders. According to John Parks, the band's tour manager, it was widely suspected in the Hollywood community that Manson was responsible for the murders, and it had been known that Manson had been involved with the Beach Boys, causing the band to be viewed as pariahs for a time. In November, police apprehended Manson, and his connection with the Beach Boys received media attention. He was later convicted for several counts of murder and conspiracy to murder. Selling of the band's publishing in April 1969. The band revisited its 1967 lawsuit against Capitol after it alleged an audit revealed the band was owed over $2 million for unpaid royalties and production duties. In May, Brian told the music press that the group's funds were depleted to the point that it was considering filing for bankruptcy at the end of the year, which Disc and Music Echo called "stunning news" and a "tremendous shock on the American pop scene." Brian hoped that the success of a forthcoming single, "Break Away," would mend the financial issues. The song, written and produced by Brian and Murry, reached number 63 in the US and number 6 in the UK, and Brian's remarks to the press ultimately thwarted long-simmering contract negotiations with Deutsche Grammophon. The group's Capitol contract expired 2 weeks later with one more album still due, after which the label deleted the Beach Boys' catalog from print, effectively cutting off their royalty flow. The lawsuit was later settled in their favor and they acquired the rights to their post-1965 catalog. In August, Sea of Tunes, the Beach Boys' catalog, was sold to Irving Almo Music for $700,000. According to his wife, Marilyn Wilson, Brian was devastated by the sale. Over the years, the catalog generated more than $100 million in publishing royalties, none of which Murry or the band members ever received. 1970 to 1978. Reprise-era Sunflower and Surf's Up. The group was signed to Reprise Records in 1970. Scott Schinder described the label as, probably the hippest and most artist-friendly major label of the time. The deal was brokered by Van Dyke Parks, who was then employed as a multimedia executive at Warner Music Group. Reprise's contract stipulated Brian's proactive involvement with the band in all albums. By the time the Beach Boys' tenure ended with Capitol in 1969, they had sold 65 million records worldwide, closing the decade as the most commercially successful American group in popular music. After recording over 30 different songs and going through several album titles, their first LP for Reprise, Sunflower, was released on August 31, 1970. Sunflower featured a strong group presence with significant writing contributions from all band members. Brian was active during this period, writing or co-writing 7 of Sunflower's 12 songs and performing at half of the band's domestic concerts in 1970. The album received critical acclaim in both the US and the UK. This was offset by the album reaching only number 151 on US record charts during a 4-week stay, becoming the worst-selling Beach Boys album at that point. In his Rolling Stone review, Jim Miller praised the album as "without doubt the best Beach Boys album in recent memory, a stylistically coherent tour de force," but mused, "It makes one wonder though whether anyone still listens to their music, or could give a shit about it." In the UK, the album reached 29. Fans generally regard the LP as the Beach Boys' finest post-Pet Sounds album. In 2003, it placed at number 380 on Rolling Stone's Greatest Albums of All Time list. In 1969, Brian opened a short-lived health food store, the Radiant Radish. While working there, he met journalist and radio presenter Jack Reilly. Reilly spoke with Brian for a radio interview, with the subject eventually turning to the unreleased song, Surf's Up, a track that had taken on notoriety since Smile's demise 3 years earlier. Brian did not feel it should be released. In August 1970, Reilly offered a 6-page memo ruminating on how to stimulate, increased record sales and popularity for the Beach Boys. Within the next few months, the Beach Boys hired him as their manager. One of his initiatives was to encourage the band to record songs featuring more socially conscious lyrics. He also requested the completion of Surf's Up, and arranged a guest appearance at a Grateful Dead concert at Bill Graham's Fillmore East in April 1971 to foreground the Beach Boys' transition into the counterculture. During this time, the group ceased wearing matching uniforms on stage. In July 1971, the Beach Boys filmed a concert for ABC TV in Central Park. It aired as Good Vibrations from Central Park on August 19, 1971. The concert also featured performances by Boz Scaggs, Kate Taylor, Carly Simon, and Ike and Tina Turner. On August 30, 1971, the band released Surf's Up, which included the title track. The album was moderately successful, reaching the U.S. Top 30, a marked improvement over their recent releases. While the record charted, the Beach Boys added to their renewed fame by performing a near-sellout set at Carnegie Hall. Their live shows during this era included reworked arrangements of many of their previous songs, with their set lists culling from Pet Sounds and Smile. Music writer Dominic Priori noted, "They basically played what they could have played at the Monterey Pop Festival in the summer of 1967. Dennis injured his hand during the Surf's Up sessions, leaving him temporarily unable to play the drums. So Tough, Holland, and Greatest Hits LP's Ricky Fattar and Blondie Chaplin joined the band in early 1972, with Johnston departing shortly thereafter. The new lineup released the comparatively unsuccessful Carl and the Passions, So Tough in May, followed by Holland in January 1973. Reprise felt Holland needed a strong single. Following the intervention of Van Dyke Parks, this resulted in the inclusion of Sail on, Sailor, a long germinating collaboration between Brian, Parks, Tandon Almer, Ray Kennedy and Reilly that featured a soulful lead vocal by Chaplin. Reprise approved, and the resulting album outpaced Carl and the Passions from a commercial standpoint, peaking at number 37. Brian's musical children's story, Mount Vernon and Fairway, was included as a bonus EP. In August 1973, the 41-song soundtrack to American Graffiti was released, including the band's early songs, Surfin' Safari, and All Summer Long. The album was a catalyst in creating a wave of nostalgia that reaffirmed the relevance of the Beach Boys in the popular American consciousness. Chaplin also left in late 1973 after an argument with Steve Love, the band's business manager. In June 1974, Capitol issued Endless Summer, the band's first major pre-Pet Sounds Greatest Hits package. It rose to the top of the Billboard charts in October and remained on the charts for 2 years, the longest of any Beach Boys release. In April 1975, Capitol followed up with a second compilation, Spirit of America, which also sold well. With these compilations, the Beach Boys became one of the most popular acts in rock, propelling themselves from opening for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young in the summer of 1974 to headliners selling out basketball arenas in a matter of weeks. Rolling Stone named the Beach Boys the «Band of the Year» for 1974. Fattar remained with the band until 1974, when he was offered a chance to join a new group led by future Eagles member Joe Walsh. By this juncture, businessman and Chicago producer James William Guercio had replaced Chaplin in the touring band at the behest of Dennis, a longtime friend. He started offering the group career advice that resulted in his becoming their new manager. A new album was attempted, with sessions held at Guercio's Caribou Ranch recording studio in Colorado and at the band's brother studios in L.A. Only a scattering of material from these sessions saw eventual release. The impetus had shifted from recording new material to large venue touring, and under Guercio, the Beach Boys staged a successful 1975 joint concert tour with Chicago. As part of the program, Each group performed some of the other's songs, including their previous year's collaboration on Chicago's single, "Wishing You Were Here." While their concerts continuously sold out and a reissue of "Sail On, Sailor" peaked at number 49 in May 1975, Garcia prevailed upon the group to revert from a contemporary stage presentation followed by oldies encores to a show made up of mostly pre-1967 music. Brian's Back, 15 Big Ones, and Love You. Brian spent the majority of 2 years secluded in the chauffeur's quarters of his home, abusing alcohol, taking drugs, overeating, and exhibiting other self-destructive behavior. In 1975, Brian attempted to join California Music, a Los Angeles collective that included Bruce Johnston and Gary Usher. The Beach Boys' recent Endless Summer compilation was selling well, and the band was touring non-stop, making them the biggest live draw in the U.S. Garcia was then fired by the group and replaced by Steve Love, who urged the group to encourage Brian to return to the production helm. In October, Marilyn persuaded Brian to admit himself to the care of psychologist Eugene Landy, who kept him from indulging in substance abuse with constant supervision. At the end of January 1976, the Beach Boys returned to the studio with Brian producing once again. Landy supervised group meetings, and discussions over each song for the record reportedly lasted up to 8 hours. Brian decided the band should do an album of rock and roll and doo-wop standards. Carl and Dennis disagreed, feeling that an album of originals was far more ideal, while Love and Jardine wanted the album out as quickly as possible. Brian's production role was undermined as group members overdubbed and remixed tracks without his knowledge, to fight against his desire for a rough, unfinished sound. He later attributed his hoarse voice on the album to a bout of laryngitis. Released on July 5, 1976, 15 Big Ones was generally disliked by fans and critics upon release. Its lead single, a cover of Chuck Berry's "Rock and Roll Music," peaked at number 5. Carl and Dennis disparaged the album to the press, while Brian expressed optimism that their next release would be on par with "Good Vibrations." An August 1976 NBC TV special, The Beach Boys, was produced by Saturday Night Live creator Lorne Michaels, and featured appearances by SNL cast members John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd. In December, Brian was released from Landy's program due to disputes over Landy's fee. From late 1976 to early 1977, Brian made sporadic public appearances and produced the band's next album, The Beach Boys' Love You, a collection of 14 songs mostly written, arranged and produced alone. He later called Love You one of his favorite Beach Boys releases, saying, "That's when it all happened for me. That's where my heart lies." The album's engineer, Earl Menke, compared it to the surrealist film Eraserhead, and said that while it was light-hearted on the surface, it was intended to be a serious, autobiographical work. In Pitchfork, D. Eric Kempke wrote that the album stands in sharp contrast to the albums that preceded and followed it, because it was a product of genuine inspiration on Brian Wilson's part, with little outside interference. Released on April 11, 1977, Love You peaked at number 53 in the US and number 28 in the UK. It was divided between fans and critics. Some saw the album as a work of eccentric genius, whereas others dismissed it as childish and trivial. In a review for Circus, Lester Bangs called the Beach Boys a diseased bunch of motherfuckers if ever there was one. But the miracle is that the Beach Boys have made that disease sound like the literal babyflesh pink of health. The album was released weeks after the band signed a new record deal with CBS. Momentary breakup. An MIU album after Love You was released, Brian assembled Adult, Child, an unreleased effort largely consisting of songs written by Brian from 1976 and 1977 with select big band arrangements by Dick Reynolds. Although publicized as the Beach Boys' next release, Adult, Child caused tension within the group and was ultimately shelved. Following this period, his concert appearances with the band gradually diminished and their performances were occasionally erratic. The internal wrangling came to a head after a show at Central Park on September 1, 1977, when the band effectively split into two camps: Dennis and Carl Wilson on one side, Mike Love and Al Jardine on the other, with Brian remaining neutral. Following a confrontation on an airport tarmac, Dennis declared to Rolling Stone on September 3 that he had left the band. "It was Al Jardine who really knifed me in the heart when he said they didn't need me. That was the clincher. And all I told him was that he couldn't play more than 4 chords. They kept telling me I had my solo album now, like I should go off in a corner and leave the Beach Boys to them. The album really bothers them. They don't like to admit it's doing so well. They never even acknowledge it in interviews." The band broke up for 2.5 weeks, until a meeting on September 17 at Brian's house. In light of a potential new Caribou Records contract, the parties negotiated a settlement resulting in Love gaining control of Brian's vote in the group, allowing Love and Jardine to outvote Carl and Dennis Wilson on any matter. Dennis started to withdraw from the group to focus on his second solo album, Bamboo. The album was shelved just as alcoholism and marital problems overcame all three Wilson brothers. Carl appeared intoxicated during concerts and Brian gradually slid back into addiction and an unhealthy lifestyle. Their last album for Reprise, MIU album, was recorded at Maharishi International University in Iowa at the suggestion of Love. Dennis and Carl made limited contributions. The album was mostly produced by Jardine and Ron Altbach, with Brian credited as executive producer. MIU was largely a contractual obligation to finish out their association with Reprise, who likewise did not promote the result. 1979 to 1998. Continued recording and Brian's estrangement LA and Keepin' the Summer Alive. In an April 1980 interview, Carl reflected that, "The last 2 years have been the most important and difficult time of our career. We were at the ultimate crossroads. We had to decide whether what we had been involved in since we were teenagers had lost its meaning. We asked ourselves and each other the difficult questions we'd often avoided in the past." By the next year, he left the touring group because of unhappiness with the band's nostalgia format and lackluster live performances, subsequently pursuing a solo career. He stated, "I haven't quit the Beach Boys, but I do not plan on touring with them until they decide that 1981 means as much to them as 1961. Carl returned in May 1982, after approximately 14 months of being away, on the condition that the group reconsider their rehearsal and touring policies and refrain from Las Vegas-type engagements. In late 1982, Brian overdosed on a combination of alcohol, cocaine, and other psychoactive drugs. His previous therapist Eugene Landy was once more employed, and a more radical program was undertaken to try to restore Brian to health. This involved removing him from the group on November 5, 1982, at the behest of Carl, Love, and Jardine, in addition to putting him on a rigorous diet and health regimen. Coupled with long, extreme counseling sessions, this therapy was successful in bringing Brian back to physical health, slimming down from 311 pounds to 185 pounds. Death of Dennis, the Beach Boys, and Still Cruisin' in 1983. Tensions between Dennis and Love escalated so high that each obtained a restraining order against the other. With the rest of the band fearing that he would end up like Brian, Dennis was given an ultimatum after his last performance in November 1983 to check into rehab for his alcohol problems or be banned from performing live with them. Dennis checked into rehab for his chance to get sober, but on December 28, 1983, he drowned at the age of 39 in Marina del Rey while diving from a friend's boat trying to recover items that he had previously thrown overboard in fits of rage. Between 1983 and 1986, Landy charged Brian about $430,000 annually. When he requested more money, Carl was obliged to give away a quarter of Brian's publishing royalties. As Brian's recovery consolidated, he stopped working with the Beach Boys on a regular basis. Commenting on his relationship to the band in 1988, Brian said that he avoided his family at Landy's suggestion, and that, although we stay together as a group, as people we're a far cry from friends. In the mid-1980s, Landy stated, "I influence all of us thinking. I'm practically a member of the band. Partners in life." Brian later responded to allegations with, "People say that Dr. Landy runs my life, but the truth is, I'm in charge." Mike Love denied Landy's accusation that he and the band were keeping Brian from participating with the group, and later wrote that Landy's goal was to destroy us, the sole custodian of Brian's career and legacy. The Beach Boys spent the next several years touring, often playing in front of large audiences, and recording songs for film soundtracks and various artists' compilations. In 1988, they unexpectedly claimed their first U.S. #1 single in 22 years with "Kokomo," which topped the chart for 1 week. It appeared in the film Cocktail. They released the album Still Cruisin', which went platinum in the U.S. Lawsuits, Summer in Paradise, Stars and Stripes, Vol. 1, and death of Carl Love filed a defamation lawsuit against Bryan due to how he was presented in Bryan's 1992 memoir Wouldn't It Be Nice? My Own Story. Its publisher HarperCollins settled the suit for $1.5 million. He said that the suit allowed his lawyer to gain access to the transcripts of Bryan's interviews with his collaborator, Todd Gold. Those interviews affirmed, according to Bryan, that I had been the inspiration of the group and that I had written many of the songs that in dispute. Other defamation lawsuits were filed by Carl, Brother Records, and the Wilsons' mother Audrey. With Love and Bryan unable to determine exactly what Love was properly owed, Love sued Bryan in 1992, winning $13 million in 1994 for lost royalties. 35 of the group's songs were then amended to credit Love. He later called it, almost certainly the largest case of fraud in music history. The day after California courts issued a restraining order between Bryan and Landy, Bryan phoned Sire Records staff producer Andy Paley to collaborate on new material tentatively for the Beach Boys. After losing the songwriting credits lawsuit with Love, Bryan told Mojo in February 1995, "Mike and I are just cool. There's a lot of shit Andy and I got written for him. I just had to get through that goddamn trial." In April, it was unclear whether the project would turn into a Wilson solo album, a Beach Boys album, or a combination of the two. The project ultimately disintegrated. Instead, Bryan and his bandmates recorded Stars and Stripes Vol. 1, an album of country music stars covering Beach Boys songs, with co-production helmed by River North Records owner Joe Thomas. Afterward, the group discussed finishing the album Smile, but Carl rejected the idea, fearing that it would cause Bryan another nervous breakdown. In early 1997, Carl was diagnosed with lung and brain cancer after years of heavy smoking. Despite his terminal condition, Carl continued to perform with the band on its 1997 summer tour while undergoing chemotherapy. During performances, he sat on a stool and needed oxygen after every song. Carl died on February 6, 1998, at the age of 51, 2 months after the death of the Wilsons' mother, Audrey. 1998–present. Love-led tour's band name litigation. After Carl's death, Jardine left the touring lineup and began to perform regularly with his band, Beach Boys, Family and Friends, until he ran into legal issues for using the name without license. Meanwhile, Jardine sued Love, claiming that he had been excluded from their concerts. Bree, through its longtime attorney, Ed McPherson, sued Jardine in federal court. Jardine, in turn, counter-claimed against Bree for wrongful termination. Bree ultimately prevailed. In 2000, ABC TV premiered a 2-part television miniseries, The Beach Boys: An American Family, that dramatized the Beach Boys' story. It was produced by John Stamos, and was criticized by numerous parties, including Wilson, for historical inaccuracies. In 2004, Wilson recorded and released his solo album Brian Wilson Presents Smile, a reinterpretation of the unfinished Smile project. That September, Wilson issued a free CD through the mail on Sunday that included Beach Boys songs he had recently re-recorded, 5 of which he co-authored with Love. The 10-track compilation had 2.6 million copies distributed and prompted Love to file a lawsuit in November 2005. He claimed the promotion hurt the sales of the original recordings. Love's suit was dismissed in 2007 when a judge determined that there were no triable issues. That's Why God Made the Radio and brief reunion tour on October 31, 2011. Capitol released a compilation and box set dedicated to Smile in the form of the Smile Sessions. The album garnered universal critical acclaim and charted in both the US Billboard and UK Top 30. It went on to win Best Historical Album at the 2013 Grammy Awards. On December 16, 2011, it was announced that Wilson, Love, Jardine, Johnston and David Marks would reunite for a new album and 50th anniversary tour. On February 12, 2012, the Beach Boys performed at the 2012 Grammy Awards, in what was billed as a «special performance» by organizers. It marked the group's first live performance to include Wilson since 1996, Jardine since 1998, and Marks since 1999. Released on June 5, That's Why God Made the Radio debuted at number 3 on the U.S. charts, expanding the group's span of Billboard 200 Top 10 albums across 49 years and 1 week, passing the Beatles with 47 years of Top 10 albums. Critics generally regarded the album as an uneven collection, with most of the praise centered on its closing musical suite. The reunion tour ended in September 2012 as planned, but amid erroneous rumors that Love had dismissed Wilson from the Beach Boys. Love and Johnston continued to perform under the Beach Boys name, while Wilson, Jardine, and Marks continued to tour as a trio, and a subsequent tour with guitarist Jeff Beck also included Blondie Chaplin at select dates. Copyright extension releases responding to a new European Union copyright law that extended copyright to 70 years for recordings that were published within 50 years after they were made. Capitol began issuing annual 50-year anniversary copyright extension releases of Beach Boys recordings, starting with The Big Beat 1963. Jardine, Marks, Johnston and Love appeared together at the 2014 Ella Awards ceremony, where Love was honored for his work as a singer. In 2015, Soundstage aired an episode featuring Wilson performing with Jardine, Chaplin, and Fattar at the Venetian in Las Vegas. In April, when asked if he was interested in making music with Love again, Wilson replied, "I don't think so, no," adding in July that he doesn't talk to the Beach Boys' Mike Love. In 2016, Love and Wilson published memoirs, Good Vibrations, My Life as a Beach Boy and I Am Brian Wilson, respectively. Asked about negative comments that Wilson made about him in the book, Love challenged the legitimacy of statements attributed to Wilson in the book and in the press. In an interview with Rolling Stone conducted in June 2016, Wilson said he would like to try to repair his relationship with Love and collaborate with him again. In January 2017, Love said, "If it were possible to make it just Brian and I, and have it under control and done better than what happened in 2012, then yeah, I'd be open to something." In July 2018, Wilson, Jardine, Love, Johnston, and Marks reunited for a one-off Q&A session moderated by director Rob Reiner at the Capitol Records Tower in Los Angeles. It was the first time the band had appeared together in public since their 2012 tour. That December, Love described his new holiday album, Reason for the Season, as a message to Brian, and said that he would love nothing more than to get together with Brian and do some music. In February 2020, Wilson and Jardine's official social media pages encouraged fans to boycott the band's music after it was announced that Love's Beach Boys would perform at the Safari Club International Convention in Reno, Nevada on animal rights grounds. The concert proceeded despite online protests, as Love issued a statement that said his group has always supported freedom of thought and expression as a fundamental tenet of our rights as Americans. In October, Love and Johnston's Beach Boys performed at a fundraiser for Donald Trump's presidential re-election campaign. Wilson and Jardine again issued a statement that they had not been informed about this performance and did not support it. Selling of the band's intellectual property in March 2020, Jardine was asked about a possible reunion and responded that the band would reunite for a string of live performances in 2021, although he believed a new album was unlikely. In response to reunion rumors, Love said in May that he was open to a 60th anniversary tour, although Wilson has some serious health issues, while Wilson's manager Gene Sievers commented that no one had spoken to Wilson about such a tour. In February 2021, it was announced that Brian Wilson, Love, Jardine, and the estate of Carl Wilson had sold a majority stake in the band's intellectual property to Irving Azoff and his new company Iconic Artists Group. Rumors of a 60th anniversary reunion were again discussed. In April 2021, Omnivore Recordings released California Music Presents Add Some Music, an album featuring Love, Jardine, Marks, Johnston, and several children of the original Beach Boys. In August, Capitol released the box set Feel Flows, The Sunflower and Surf's Up Sessions 1969–1971. In 2022, the group is expected to participate in a 60th anniversary celebration. Azoff stated in an interview from May 2021, "We're going to announce a major deal with a streamer for the definitive documentary on the Beach Boys and a 60th anniversary celebration. We're planning a tribute concert affiliated with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and SiriusXM, with amazing acts. That's adding value, and that's why I invested in the Beach Boys." Musical Style and Development in Understanding Rock, Essays in Musical Analysis, musicologist Daniel Harrison writes, even from their inception, the Beach Boys were an experimental group.
They combined, as Jim Miller has put it, the instrumental sleekness of the Ventures, the lyric sophistication of Chuck Berry, and the vocal expertise of some weird cross between the Letterman and Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, with lyrics whose images, idioms, and concerns were drawn from the rarefied world of the middle-class white male Southern California teenager.
It was the profound vocal virtuosity of the group, coupled with the obsessional drive and compositional ambitions of their leader, Brian Wilson, that promised their survival after the eventual breaking of fad fever.
Comparison to other vocally oriented rock groups, such as The Association, shows the Beach Boys' technique to be far superior, almost embarrassingly so. They were so confident of their ability, and of Brian's skill as a producer to enhance it, that they were unafraid of doing sophisticated, a cappella glee club arrangements containing multiple suspensions, passing formations, complex chords, and both chromatic and enharmonic modulations.
The Beach Boys began as a garage band playing 1950s-style rock and roll, reassembling styles of music such as surf to include vocal jazz harmony, which created their unique sound.
In addition, they introduced their signature approach to common genres such as the pop ballad by applying harmonic or formal twists not native to rock and roll. Among the distinct elements of the Beach Boys' style were the nasal quality of their singing voices, their use of a falsetto harmony over a driving, locomotive-like melody, and the sudden chiming in of the whole group on a key line.
Brian Wilson handled most stages of the group's recording process from the beginning, even though he was not properly credited on most of the early recordings.
Early on, Mike Love sang lead vocals in the rock-oriented songs, while Carl contributed guitar lines on the group's ballads. Jim Miller commented, on straight rockers they sang tight harmonies behind Love's lead. On ballads, Brian played his falsetto off against lush, jazz-tinged voicings, often using unorthodox harmonic structures. Harrison adds that even the least distinguished of the Beach Boys' early up-tempo rock and roll songs show traces of structural complexity at some level. Brian was simply too curious and experimental to leave convention alone. Although Brian was often dubbed a perfectionist, he was an inexperienced musician, and his understanding of music was mostly self-taught. At the lyric stage, he usually worked with Love, whose assertive persona provided youthful swagger that contrasted Brian's explorations in romanticism and sensitivity. Luis Sanchez noted a pattern where Brian would spare surfing imagery when working with collaborators outside of his band's circle, in the examples, Lonely Sea, and In My Room.
Brian's bandmates resented the notion that he was the sole creative force in the group. In a 1966 article that asked if the Beach Boys relied too much on sound genius Brian, Carl said that although Brian was the most responsible for their music, every member of the group contributed ideas.
Mike Love wrote, "As far as I was concerned, Brian was a genius, deserving of that recognition.
But the rest of us were seen as nameless components in Brian's music machine.
It didn't feel to us as if we were just riding on Brian's coattails." Conversely, Dennis defended Brian's stature in the band, stating, "Brian Wilson is the Beach Boys.
He is the band. We're his fucking messengers. He is all of it. Period. We're nothing. He's everything." The band's earliest influences came primarily from the work of Chuck Berry and the Four Freshmen. Performed by the Four Freshmen, Their Hearts Were Full of Spring, was a particular favorite of the group. By analyzing their arrangements of pop standards, Brian educated himself on jazz harmony. Bearing this in mind, Philip Lambert noted, if Bob Flanagan helped teach Brian how to sing, then Gershwin, Kern, Porter, and the other members of this pantheon helped him learn how to craft a song. Other general influences on the group included the High Lost, the Penguins, the Robins, Bill Haley and his Comets, Otis Williams, the Cadets, the Everly Brothers, the Shirelles, the Regents, and the Crystals. The eclectic mix of white and black vocal group influences, ranging from the rock and roll of Berry, the jazz harmonies of the Four Freshmen, the pop of the Four Preps, the folk of the Kingston Trio, the R&B of groups like the Coasters and the Five Satins, and the doo-wop of Dion and the Belmonts, helped contribute to the Beach Boys' uniqueness in American popular music. Carl remembered, "Most of classmates were black. He was the only white guy on his track team. He was really immersed in doo-wop and that music, and I think he influenced Brian to listen to it." The black artists were so much better in terms of rock records in those days that the white records almost sounded like put-ons. On Jimi Hendrix and heavy music, Brian said he felt no pressure to go in that direction. "We never got into the heavy musical level trip. We never needed to.
It's already been done. Another significant influence on Brian's work was Burt Bacharach.
He said in the 1960s, "Burt Bacharach and Hal David are more like me. They're also the best pop team, per se, today."
As a producer, Bacharach has a very fresh, new approach. Regarding surf rock pioneer Dick Dale, Brian said that his influence on the group was limited to Carl and his style of guitar playing. Carl credited Chuck Berry, The Ventures, and John Walker with shaping his guitar style, and that the Beach Boys had learned to play all of the Ventures songs by ear early in their career. In 1967, Lou Reed wrote in Aspen that the Beach Boys created a hybrid sound out of old rock and the Four Freshmen, explaining that such songs as Let Him Run Wild, Don't Worry Baby, I Get Around, and Fun, Fun, Fun were not unlike Peppermint Stick by the Elkhorns. Similarly, John Sebastian of the Lovin' Spoonful noted, Brian had control of this vocal palette of which we had no idea.
We had never paid attention to the Four Freshmen or doo-wop combos like the Crew Cuts.
Look what gold he mined out of that. Vocals. Brian identified each member individually for their vocal range, once detailing the ranges for Carl, Dennis, Jardine, Love, and himself. He declared in 1966 that his greatest interest was to expand modern vocal harmony, owing to his fascination with a voice to the Four Freshmen, which he considered a groovy sectional sound. He added, "The harmonies that we are able to produce give us a uniqueness which is really the only important thing you can put into records, some quality that no one else has got. I love peaks in a song, and enhancing them on the control panel. Most of all, I love the human voice for its own sake." For a period, Brian avoided singing falsetto for the group, saying, "I thought people thought I was a fairy. The band told me, if that's the way you sing, don't worry about it." From lowest intervals to highest, the group's vocal harmony stack usually began with Love or Dennis, followed by Jardine or Carl, and finally Brian on top, according to Jardine, while Carl said that the blend was Love on bottom, Carl above, followed by Dennis or Jardine, and then Brian on top. Jardine explains, "We always sang the same vocal intervals. As soon as we heard the chords on the piano we'd figure it out pretty easily. If there was a vocal move envisioned, he'd show that particular singer that move. We had somewhat photographic memory as far as the vocal parts were concerned, so that never a problem for us." Striving for perfection, Brian ensured that his intricate vocal arrangements exercised the group's calculated blend of intonation, attack, phrasing, and expression. Sometimes, he would sing each vocal harmony part alone through multi-track tape. On the group's blend, Carl said, "has a beautifully rich, very full-sounding bass voice. Yet his lead singing is real nasal, real punk. S voice has a bright timbre to it, it really cuts. My voice has a kind of calm sound. We're big ooh-ers, we love to ooh. It's a big, full sound, that's very pleasing to us, it opens up the heart." Rock critic Eric Davis wrote, "The purity of tone and genetic proximity that smoothed their voices was almost creepy, pseudo-castrato, a barbershop sound." Jimmy Webb said, "They used very little vibrato and sing in very straight tones. The voices all lie down beside each other very easily, there's no bumping between them because the pitch is very precise." According to Brian, Jack Good once told us, "You sing like eunuchs in a Sistine Chapel," which was a pretty good quote. Writer Richard Goldstein reported that, according to a fellow journalist who asked Brian about the black roots of his music, Brian's response was, "We're white and we sing white." Goldstein added that when he asked where his approach to vocal harmonies had derived from, Wilson answered, "Barbershop." Use of studio musicians. 9 months after forming, the group achieved national success, and demand for their personal appearance skyrocketed. Biographer James Murphy said, "By most contemporary accounts, they were not a very good live band when they started. The Beach Boys learned to play as a band in front of live audiences, eventually to become one of the best and enduring live bands." For the recording of the Beach Boys' instrumental tracks, Brian arranged many of his compositions for a conglomerate of session musicians later known as the Wrecking Crew. Their assistance was needed because of the increasingly complicated nature of the material. Afterward, the members only performed the instrumental tracks to certain recordings. It is the belief of Richie Unterberger that, before session musicians took over most of the parts, the Beach Boys could play respectably gutsy surf rock as a self-contained unit. Carl was an exception among the group in that he played alongside these musicians whenever he was available to attend sessions. In archivist Craig Slowinski's view, one should not sell short Carl's own contributions.
The youngest Wilson had developed as a musician sufficiently to play alongside the horde of high-dollar session pros that Big Brother was now bringing into the studio. Carl's guitar playing a key ingredient. A common misconception is that Dennis' drumming in the Beach Boys recordings was filled in exclusively by studio musicians. His drumming is documented on a number of the group's singles, including I Get Around, Fun, 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 and Don't Worry Baby.
Spirituality. The band members often reflected on the spiritual nature of their music, particularly for the recording of Pet Sounds and Smile. Even though the Wilsons did not grow up in a particularly religious household, Carl was described as the most truly religious person I know by Brian, and Carl was forthcoming about the group's spiritual beliefs, stating, "We believe in God as a kind of universal consciousness.
God is love. God is you. God is me. God is everything right here in this room.
It's a spiritual concept which inspires a great deal of our music." Carl told Rave magazine in 1967 that the group's influences are of a religious nature, but not any religion in specific, only an idea based upon that of universal consciousness.
The
spiritual concept of happiness and doing good to others is extremely important to the lyric of our songs, and the religious element of some of the better church music is also contained within some of our new work. Brian is quoted during the Smile era, "I'm very religious. Not in the sense of churches, going to church, but like the essence of all religion." During the recording of Pet Sounds, Brian held prayer meetings, later reflecting that God was with us the whole time we were doing this record. "I could feel that feeling in my brain." In 1966, he explained that he wanted to move into a white spiritual sound, and predicted that the rest of the music industry would follow suit.
In 2011, Brian maintained the spirituality was important to his music, and that he did not follow any particular religion. Carl said that Smile was chosen as an album title because of its connection to the group's spiritual beliefs. Brian referred to Smile as his teenage symphony to God, composing a hymn, Our Prayer, as the album's opening spiritual invocation. Experimentation with psychotropic substances also proved pivotal to the group's development as artists. He spoke of his LSD trips as a religious experience, and during a session for Our Prayer, Brian can be heard asking the other Beach Boys, "Do you guys feel any acid yet?" In 1968, the group's interest in transcendental meditation led them to record the original song, Transcendental Meditation. Legacy and cultural influence, achievements and accolades. The Beach Boys are one of the most critically acclaimed, commercially successful, and influential bands of all time. They have sold over 100 million records worldwide. The group's early songs made them major pop stars in the US, the UK, Australia and other countries, having 7 top 10 singles between April 1963 and November 1964. They were one of the first American groups to exhibit the definitive traits of a self-contained rock band, playing their own instruments and writing their own songs, and they were one of the few American bands formed prior to the 1964 British invasion to continue their success. Among artists of the 1960s, they are one of the central figures in the histories of rock. Between the 1960s and 2010s, they had 36 songs reach the U.S. Top 40 with 4 topping the Billboard Hot 100. They also hold Nielsen SoundScan's record as the top-selling American band for albums and singles. Brian Wilson's artistic control over the Beach Boys' records was unprecedented for the time. Carl Wilson elaborated, record companies were used to having absolute control over their artists. It was especially nervy, because Brian was a 21-year-old kid with just 2 albums. It was unheard of. But what could they say? Brian made good records. This made the Beach Boys one of the first rock groups to exert studio control. Music producers after the mid-1960s would draw on Brian's influence, setting a precedent that allowed bands and artists to enter a recording studio and act as producers, either autonomously, or in conjunction with other like minds. The band routinely appears in the upper reaches of ranked lists such as, the Top 1000 Albums of All Time. Many of the group's songs and albums, including The Beach Boys' Today, Smiley Smile, Sunflower, and Surf's Up, and especially Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations, are featured in numerous lists devoted to the greatest albums or singles of all time. The latter two frequently appear on the number 1 spot. On Acclaimed Music, which aggregates the rankings of decades of critics' lists, Pet Sounds is ranked as the greatest album of all time, while Good Vibrations is the 3rd greatest song of all time. The group itself is ranked number 11 in its 1000 most recommended artists of all time.
In 2004, Rolling Stone ranked the band number 12 on the magazine's list of the 100 greatest artists of all time.
In 1988, the core quintet of the Wilson Brothers, Love, and Jardine were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. 10 years later, they were selected for the Vocal Group Hall of Fame.
In 2004, Pet Sounds was preserved in the National Recording Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. Their recordings of In My Room, Good Vibrations, California Girls, and the entire Pet Sounds album have been inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame.
The Beach Boys are one of the most influential acts of the rock era.
In 2017, a study of AllMusic's catalog indicated the Beach Boys as the sixth most frequently cited artist influence in its database.
For the 50th anniversary of Pet Sounds, 26 artists contributed to a Pitchfork retrospective on its influence, which included comments from members of Talking Heads, Yo La Tengo, Chairlift, and Deftones. The editor noted that the wide swath of artists assembled for this feature represent but a modicum of the album's vast measure of influence. Its scope transcends just about all lines of age, race, and gender. Its impact continues to broaden with each passing generation. In 2021, the staff of Ultimate Classic Rock ranked the Beach Boys as the top American band of all time. The publication's editor wrote in the group's entry that, few bands have had a greater impact on popular music. California Sound professor of cultural studies James M.
Curtis wrote in 1987, "We can say that the Beach Boys represent the outlook and values of white Protestant Anglo-Saxon teenagers in the early 60s.
Having said that, we immediately realize that they must mean much more than this.
Their stability, their staying power, and their ability to attract new fans prove as much." Cultural historian Kevin Starr explains that the group first connected with young Americans specifically for their lyrical interpretation of a mythologized landscape, cars and the beach, surfing, the California Girl, all this fused in the alembic of youth. Here was a way of life, an iconography, already half-released into the chords and multiple tracks of a new sound. In Robert Christgau's opinion, the Beach Boys were a touchstone for real rock and rollers, all of whom understood that the music had its most essential roots in an innocently hedonistic materialism. The group's California sound grew to national prominence through the success of their 1963 album Surfin U.S.A., which helped turn the surfing subculture into a mainstream youth-targeted advertising image widely exploited by the film, television, and food industry.
The group's surf music was not entirely of their own invention, being preceded by artists such as Dick Dale. However, previous surf musicians did not project a worldview as the Beach Boys did. The band's earlier surf music helped raise the profile of the state of California, creating its first major regional style with national significance, and establishing a musical identity for Southern California, as opposed to Hollywood. California ultimately supplanted New York as the center of popular music thanks to the success of Bryan's productions. A 1966 article discussing new trends in rock music writes that the Beach Boys popularized a type of drum beat heard in Jan and Dean's Surf City, which sounds like a locomotive getting up speed, in addition to the method of suddenly stopping in between the chorus and verse. Pete Townsend of The Who is credited with coining the term power pop, which he defined as what we play, what the Small Faces used to play, and the kind of pop the Beach Boys played in the days of fun, which I preferred. The California sound gradually evolved to reflect a more musically ambitious and mature worldview, becoming less to do with surfing and cars and more about social consciousness and political awareness. Between 1964 and 1969, it fueled innovation and transition, inspiring artists to tackle largely unmentioned themes such as sexual freedom, black pride, drugs, oppositional politics, other countercultural motifs, and war. Soft pop derived in part from this movement.
Sunshine pop producers widely imitated the orchestral style of Pet Sounds, however, the Beach Boys themselves were rarely representative of the genre, which was rooted in easy listening and advertising jingles. By the end of the 1960s, the California sound declined due to a combination of the West Coast's cultural shifts, Wilson's professional and psychological downturn, and the Manson murders, with David Howard calling it the sunset of the original California Sunshine sound. Sweetness advocated by the California myth had led to chilling darkness and unsightly rot.
Drawing from the Beach Boys' associations with Charles Manson and former California Governor Ronald Reagan, Eric Davis remarked, "The Beach Boys may be the only bridge between those deranged poles." There is a wider range of political and aesthetic sentiments in their records than in any other band in those heady times. Like the state, they expand and bloat and contradict themselves. During the 1970s, advertising jingles and imagery were predominantly based on the Beach Boys' early music and image. The group also inspired the development of the West Coast style later dubbed yacht rock. According to Jacobin's Dan O'Sullivan, the band's aesthetic was the first to be scavenged by yacht rock acts like Rupert Holmes.
O'Sullivan also cites the Beach Boys' recording of Sloop John B. as the origin of yacht rock's preoccupation with the sailors and beachgoers aesthetic that was lifted by everyone, from Christopher Cross to Eric Carmen, from Buffalo Springfield folksters like Jim Messina to Philly sound rockers like Hall & Oates. Innovations' pet sounds came to inform the developments of genres such as pop, rock, jazz, electronic, experimental, punk, and hip-hop. Similar to subsequent experimental rock LPs by Frank Zappa, the Beatles, and The Who, pet sounds featured countertextual aspects that called attention to the very recordedness of the album. Professor of American history John Robert Greene stated that the album broke new ground and took rock music away from its casual lyrics and melodic structures into what was then uncharted territory. He furthermore called it one factor which spawned the majority of trends in post-1965 rock music, the only others being Rubber Soul, the Beatles' Revolver, and the contemporary folk movement. The album was the first piece in popular music to incorporate the electro-theremin, an easier-to-play version of the theremin, as well as the first in rock music to feature a theremin-like instrument. With Pet Sounds, they were also the first group to make an entire album that departed from the usual small ensemble electric rock band format. According to David Leaf in 1978, Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations established the group as the leaders of a new type of pop music, art rock. Academic Bill Martin states that the band opened a path in rock music that went from Sgt. Pepper's to Close to the Edge and beyond. He argues that the advancing technology of multitrack recording and mixing boards were more influential to experimental rock than electronic instruments such as the synthesizer, allowing the Beatles and the Beach Boys to become the first crop of non-classically trained musicians to create extended and complex compositions. In Strange Sounds, Offbeat Instruments and Sonic Experiments in Pop, Mark Brend writes, other artists and producers, notably the Beatles and Phil Spector, had used varied instrumentation and multi-tracking to create complex studio productions before. And others, like Roy Orbison, had written complicated pop songs before. But Good Vibrations eclipsed all that came before it, in both its complexity as a production and the liberties it took with conventional notions of how to structure a pop song. The making of Good Vibrations, according to Dominic Priori, was unlike anything previous in the realms of classical, jazz, international, soundtrack, or any other kind of recording, while biographer Peter Ames Carlin wrote that it sounded like nothing that had ever been played on the radio before. It contained previously untried mixes of instruments, and was the first successful pop song to have cellos in a juddering rhythm. Musicologist Charlie Gillett called it one of the first records to flaunt studio production as a quality in its own right, rather than as a means of presenting a performance. Again, Brian employed the use of electro-theremin for the track. Upon release, the single prompted an unexpected revival in theremins while increasing awareness of analog synthesizers, leading Moog Music to produce their own brand of ribbon-controlled instruments. In a 1968 editorial for Jazz and Pop, Gene Scolati predicted that the song may yet prove to be the most significantly revolutionary piece of the current rock renaissance. In no minor way, Good Vibrations is a primary influential piece for all producing rock artists. Everyone has felt its import to some degree. Discussing Smiley Smile, Daniel Harrison argues that the album could almost be considered art music in the Western classical tradition, and that the group's innovations in the musical language of rock can be compared to those that introduced atonal and other non-traditional techniques into that classical tradition. He explains, the spirit of experimentation is just as palpable as it is in, say, Schoenberg's Op. 11 piano pieces. However, such notions were not widely acknowledged by rock audiences nor by the classically minded at the time. Harrison concludes, "What influences could these innovations then have? The short answer is, not much. Smiley Smile, Wild Honey, Friends, and 2020 sound like few other rock albums. They are sui generis." It must be remembered that the commercial failure of the Beach Boys' experiments was hardly motivation for imitation.
Musicologist David Toop, who included the Smiley Smile track, Fall Breaks and Back to Winter, on a companion CD for his book Ocean of Sound, placed the Beach Boys' effect on sound pioneering in league with Les Baxter, Aphex Twin, Herbie Hancock, King Tubby, and My Bloody Valentine. Sunflower marked an end to the experimental songwriting and production phase initiated by Smiley Smile. After Surf's Up, Harrison wrote, "Their albums contain a mixture of middle-of-the-road music entirely consonant with pop style during the early 1970s, with a few oddities that proved that the desire to push beyond conventional boundaries was not dead, until 1974, the year in which the Beach Boys ceased to be a rock and roll act and became an oldies act." Punk, alternative, and indie in the 1970s, the Beach Boys served a totemic influence on punk rock that later gave way to indie rock. Brad Shoup of Stereogum surmised that, thanks to the Ramones' praise for the group, many punk, pop-punk, or punk-adjacent artists showed influence from the Beach Boys, noting cover versions of the band's songs recorded by Slicky Boys, Agent Orange, Bad Religion, Shonen Knife, The Queers, High Standard, The Descendants, The Donnas, M.O.D., and The Vandals. The Beach Boys' Love You is sometimes considered the group's punk album, and Pet Sounds is sometimes advanced as the first emo album. In the 1990s, the Beach Boys experienced a resurgence of popularity with the alternative rock generation. According to Sean O'Hagan, leader of the High Llamas and former member of Stereolab, a younger generation of record buyers stopped listening to indie records in favor of the Beach Boys. Bands who advocated for the Beach Boys included founding members of the Elephant Six Collective. United by a shared love of the group's music, they named Pet Sounds Studio in honor of the band. Rolling Stone writer Barry Walters wrote in 2000 that albums such as Surf's Up and Love You are becoming sonic blueprints, akin to what early Velvet Underground LPs meant to the previous indie peer group. The High Llamas, Eric Matthews and Saint Etienne are among the alt heroes who contributed cover versions of unreleased, overlooked or underappreciated Wilson Beach Boys obscurities on the tribute album Caroline Now. The Beach Boys remained among the most significant influences on indie rock into the late 2000s. Smile became a touchstone for many bands who were labeled chamber pop, a term used for artists influenced by the lush orchestrations of Brian Wilson, Lee Hazelwood, and Burt Bacharach. Pitchfork writer Mark Richardson cited Smiley Smile as the origin point of the kind of lo-fi bedroom pop that would later propel Sebadoh, Animal Collective, and other characters. The Sunflower track, All I Wanna Do, is also cited as one of the earliest precursors to chillwave, a microgenre that emerged in 2009. Critical perspective between 1965 and 1967. The Beach Boys developed a musical and lyrical sophistication that contrasted their work from before and after. This divide was further solidified by the difference in sound between their albums and their stage performances. When the band's studio recordings grew more complex, they were unable to effectively reproduce them in their live show. Starting in 1966, band publicist Derek Taylor was instrumental in campaigning the idea of Brian Wilson as a «genius» to members of the burgeoning rock press, painting him as a mastermind who stays at home composing while the rest of the band tour. All of these elements combined to create a split fanbase corresponding to two distinct musical markets. One group is the conservative audience who enjoys the band's early singles as a wholesome representation of American popular culture from before the political and social movements brought on in the mid-1960s. The other group also appreciates the early songs for their energy and complexity, but not as much as the band's ambitious work that was created during the formative psychedelic era. Initially, rock music journalists valued the Beach Boys' early records over their experimental work. Real surfers were critical of the band for not being true adherents of the sport. As authenticity became a higher concern among critics, the group's legitimacy in rock music became an oft-repeated criticism, especially since their early songs appeared to celebrate a politically unconscious youth culture. Music critic Kenneth Partridge blamed the lack of edginess on the group's early records for why they are rarely talked about in the same breath as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and when they are, it's really only because of two albums. The particular appeal of Wilson's genius, according to music critic Barney Hoskins, was the fact that the Beach Boys were the very obverse of hip, the unlikeliness of these songs growing out of disposable surf pop, and in the singular naivety and ingenuousness of his personality. Luis Sanchez argued that despite the immaturity of their early songs, What matters is that it captured a lack of self-consciousness, a genuineness, that set them apart from their peers. And it was this quality that came to define Brian's oeuvre as he moved beyond and into bigger pop productions that would culminate in Smile. Generally, the record-buying public came to view the music made after Smile as the point marking their artistic decline.
After Smiley Smile, the group was virtually blacklisted by the music press, to the extent that reviews of the group's records were either withheld from publication or published long after the release dates. Mike Love said that, unlike Brian, he was never concerned about being taken seriously by critics, and considered the negatively described simplicity of their early songs as elitism at its worst. Because so many people loved our music, there must be something wrong with it. In a review of the Smile sessions for New Music Box, Franco Terry argued that the popular caricature of the Beach Boys as a light-hearted party band ensured that they will never earn themselves the same pride of place in American music history held by other great innovators.
Peter Ames Carlin summarized the group's various phases. Once surfin' pin-ups, they remade themselves as avant-garde pop artists, then psychedelic oracles. After that they were down-home hippies, then retro hip icons. Eventually they devolved into none of the above, a kind of perpetual motion nostalgia machine. Since the 1990s, there has been an increasing tendency to recontextualize the Beach Boys outside of their typical iconography, with academic Kirk Kernet citing such examples as the use of Sloop John B. as Vietnam allegory in the film Forrest Gump and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times as an LSD-inspired underscore for one episode of the television drama Mad Men. Landmarks. The Wilsons' California house, where the Wilson brothers grew up and the group began, was demolished in 1986 to make way for Interstate 105, the Century Freeway. A Beach Boys historic landmark, dedicated on May 20, 2005, marks the location. On December 30, 1980, the Beach Boys were awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, located at 1500 Vine Street. On September 2, 1977, the group performed before an audience of 40,000 at Narragansett Park in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, which remains the largest concert audience in Rhode Island history. In 2017, the street where the concert stage formerly stood was officially renamed to Beach Boys Way.